Hi, everyone, and welcome to Build It Better. Super excited with this podcast. Here we have Jay Phelps.
Hello, everyone.
Jay is our guest today. My name is Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at Lady Elite. I saw Ben's face kind of go like, wait, what's she doing? Yes. Hi, Ben.
Yeah. So Jay doesn't know that she trolls me at the beginning of every one of these things. Like sometimes she introduces me and sometimes she waits for me to do it. So there's the awkward pause of me being like, or just like
I know, it's my favorite. His face,
Yeah.
his eyes open a little bit and he kind of leans forward like he's ready. I'm like, just kidding. I'm not catching you. Okay. Anyways, Ben is my beautiful co-host for today. Have I ever called you beautiful, Ben?
No.
First time for everything.
Yep.
Okay, Jay. So what are we talking about today?
I hear something about architecture design.
Ooh.
And that is a fun topic to talk about because I've had to do a lot of that the last year. So
yeah. Well, so what is architecture design?
Well, I mean, it's like a lot of things in software that there's going to be different definitions depending on who you talk to, where you are, et cetera, et cetera. But generally it's, the design of an architecture. But, more specifically, what I'm talking about is if there's some big new project that needs to be made, usually, especially at big companies, but even at smaller companies, it's often useful to be deliberate about design decisions in the architecture. Maybe even making a document that talks about these design decisions. And, there's even, you could even write a spec document, even in the format that you'd see from, some of the public, what WG and all that, where you say may, should, must, those sorts of words. And it's really useful. I mean, all these things are going to be more useful the bigger the company is, the more the number of people you need to coordinate with, but they're useful even for small companies. But so at Netflix, it's super useful if we're working on a project that touches all the different device platforms, iOS, Android, TV, web. It's really useful to be very deliberate in these architecture designs and have a spec document so that they can follow, the different platforms can follow it, not just right then when you initially do it, but also in subsequent things. Like when people rewrite things, very often, if you don't have a spec document, people are looking at the old code to try and derive what the behavior they should have. And sometimes that means behavior they actually shouldn't have carries over to the new system. Like technically bugs even can carry over to new systems, or they can just misinterpret how something is being done and create new bugs. So a spec document is really great because it can be the Bible of when should I log this thing, or when should I apply this action or what have you. And so right now, for the last year or so, I've been working on that server driven stuff that we talked about in a previous episode, and there's a lot of architecture design. A lot of my current job right now is that basically I'm on for lack of a better word, we call them working groups, or they're kind of like committees, where it's there'll be representatives for the different platforms. I'm representing TV and web, and then there's a representative for Android, a representative for iOS. And the reason why I'm representing two platforms is mostly because TV and web are both JavaScript platforms, both use React. So a lot of the decisions are overlapping. They're not entirely though, because web uses Apollo for their GraphQL stuff and TV uses Relay. So it's, you do have to juggle that, but so it's kind of an interesting topic. I mean, I can talk about it forever as far as what sort of processes kind of look like at these big companies, what it looks like at a small company too. I think I can talk about too, because I've done lots of startups.
Well, I feel when let's say somebody who's not an architect picks this up, right? And they're like, okay, so good example is junior developer starts as a startup.
Sure.
Is now the CTO, okay? Junior developer. Sure. Now, what is an architecture design? What's a spec document?
I think the deliberate part that Jay mentioned a couple of times is the key.
Yeah, I always love when you're I personally don't like the term architect. I get it, and I even say it sometimes, but like I always joke, if you've ever seen the Seinfeld episode where like George is, George always likes to make up new roles for himself, like what his job is when he introduces himself. And there was just one episode where someone was like, "So what do you do?" And he's like, "I'm an architect." And I always laugh at when people say they're architects, because it's like, I don't know. I always thought it sounded a little pretentious, but but honestly, the same sort of thing about software engineer. For the longest time, I felt like software engineer felt a little pretentious as well, because it's like, I don't really feel like an engineer in the same way my dad is a civil engineer. I've known lots of mechanical engineers, and I feel like, I don't know. I am a software engineer. It is my title. But I don't know. I've always had trouble with that. But anyway, that's probably a topic for another day.
Not that I look at.
I don't know. I kind of do want to talk about this a little bit, because so an architect, in my opinion, if you look at the design for something, it is kind of like a blueprint, and that you hand it off to some people, they follow it, and then they find the weird edges where the blueprint doesn't quite work, and they kind of squeeze something in there. And the person who approves that squeezing in there is usually someone that is an engineer. Like they got some sort of skill in this area. They know what could go wrong. And then, of course, there's the developers, like the folks that are just kind of gluing things together. I think there's some merit to the titles, but I agree they do sound pretentious. I'm an architect.
No, just be clear. There's merit to it. I mean, there's a reason. It was the reason why people call it architecture and architect and engineer. Like, there's a reason. It's just for reasons I probably can't explain. It just makes me feel pretentious if I say like, "Oh, I'm an architect" or something, even though my title is not currently architect. I've had the title in the past.
I will say I am with Jay a little bit in that like Subway employees or sandwich artists are closer to being artists than software developers are to being architects. Pretty much. Like, I think that there's
whatever. Point being,
they can make like smiley faces out of like the tomatoes and stuff.
But I guess in that spec doc, right? Is it like, hey, here's so it's basically just like a set of best practices and standards, right? Because you see a lot of companies kind of just, hey, let's build an MVP, and then let's build on top of this MVP, and oh my God, all of a sudden we have this crazy thing, and now we have to refactor everything, and everything's chained together, and now we have to just rebuild the whole thing from scratch. So it's probably a little bit different in Netflix, right? It's a little bit more organized than that.
You'd be surprised. I think one of the big, before we move on, I just definitely want to acknowledge that, like, hey, if you're watching this and your title is architect, I'm not saying that you are pretentious. I'm saying I am afraid other people will think I'm being pretentious.
I am.
Myself.
You're so pretentious.
I know.
That was my last title, by the way. It was architect. So
right.
I was. But I was very pretentious the entire time.
Before too, and
I drank every soda with my pinky up. I was like, I'm an architect.
But as far as like Tracy, what you're talking about, one of the things I was amazed at when I moved to, I don't live in the Bay Area anymore, but when I moved to the Bay Area first, Silicon Valley, and got entrenched in, worked at Netflix, friends with Google, Facebook, all the different big companies, the biggest surprise was how it's how these people can be incredibly talented and amazing, but at the same time, we're all just figuring this out as we go. And there is a lot of
It's not like Silicon Valley is just like this magical place where all the code is perfect. It's like,
it's not. It's
any company you go to is
the major difference between someone that's like so smart that they can like walk their way through a graph traversal interview to get into Google, and like somebody else that can't do that, who's still very smart, is the first one of those people. The tech debt that they create is so awful. Like the smarter they are, the tech debt they create is just the freaking worst. It is.
They the more scared they are,
myself included,
the more scared they are that they're in their position and they're trying so hard to like prove themselves in their position, the worse it gets. Because also the more like, sure they have to to tell everybody else they are about their decisions.
Sure.
They had
or they get
they were doing.
bored or excited about some idea and then over-engineer something that like didn't require all the engineering that they put into it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking of which, right? Like, can you I mean, when you say like architecture design, I think a lot of people think like, oh my God, don't over-engineer it. So like, is this spec doc, this architecture design, like, how do you not over-engineer something?
Yeah, I mean, I have over-engineered things thousands of times in my career, unfortunately, and it's very rarely. There's a couple times where I've intentionally over-engineered things because I had the opportunity to, and it was like
for fun.
Except for fun, and I think like there's merit in doing that. To be honest, like if you can afford the debt of the over-engineering, it can sometimes really help morale for people to not make something that otherwise is mundane really fun because it's challenging and has, uses some different technique or something like that. But where you get into trouble is where that, obviously goes overboard. And like Ben, I'm sure, is thinking of like RxJS examples, because it's like we've seen time and time again that RxJS is a great tool, but wielded in the hands of someone who doesn't recognize that they're over-engineering things and can really overuse it to the point where no one can maintain that code other than that person. And maybe that person can't even maintain it themselves after a while. And so that's not a knock on ArcGIS. You literally pick any tool. You could over-engineer. You could use Lodash too much, or you could over-engineer with promises, and et cetera, et cetera.
Or like abstracting the abstraction. And the other just abstracting. I remember one time, Jay, you and I were looking at some code and I was like, dude, I cannot figure out how to change this stupid small little text. And you had to look at it for a while and you're like, oh my God. But it's because it was like overly abstracted, something so basic as like just some simple piece of text on the website. Do you remember that?
Yeah. And it's I mean, I wish it's like a lot of things in software where it's going to be subjective on what's over-engineered. There's going to be, there's probably going to be cases where universally everyone would agree it's over-engineered. So
how do you know then? Like, how do you know you're hiring a good architect? Like if you're hired an architect and you have them come in and you have them do like an architecture design or whatever, and then you didn't know if this was good and you brought in another architect, like, how do you know what right is? Like,
I mean, things you look for and try and do when you're having the architect hat on are just off the top of my head. Like, you want to use, one of the big things is using the right tool for the job. Like if someone comes in and they're like, I'm going to build our website using Haskell, it's like red flag immediately, where it's like, not a knock on Haskell, but Haskell is not designed. The community is not, it's not for building websites. You can do it. You physically can actually use Haskell to build websites.
Monads.
Monads, yes.
Monads.
It's like a burrito, apparently. Yeah. But you shouldn't. And so like, that's an extreme example, obviously. But like, a good architect will always tell you, will never, in my opinion, this is going to be super subjective, but in my opinion, one question is like, do you have a language that you always use, or do you, like a good architect uses the tools that are best for that job, right? And can adapt to those tools. So that might be a programming language, that might be frameworks. Going back to the ArcGIS thing, like it's like, you may be an expert in RxJS, but the people who are going to maintain the code may not be. And even if they are, like, they might not be, might not know your patterns and those sorts of things. So, choosing to use RxJS is a big decision. And, you need to recognize especially if sometimes architects are deeply involved in the actual implementation, but a lot of times things are structured where it's kind of throw it over the wall sort of thing, where the architect designs something, maybe builds it, and either way throws it over the wall to people who then have to then run with it and maintain it and actually use it. And the huge disconnect can cause a lot of problems, as you can guess. So like right now, what I'm trying to do in the project, the server-driven UI thing we were talking about in the previous episode, right now I've just actually started working with some of the actual UI developers. Like I work on a shared client foundation team, so I'm kind of a UI. I'm not really a UI developer these days. I've done it in the past, but right now I'm less of a UI developer and more I do like developer experience related things, libraries, frameworks, architecture, anything really that's shared across all the different client platforms. And so with that means that since I'm not really the UI developer, I'm not the one going in and making A/B tests and building new product. I'm making stuff to make their life easier. With this new server-driven UI thing, we're just to the point now where we're working with these UI developers and actually kind of trying out and kicking the tires with some of the designs that we're implementing, and to verify that, to make sure to not just like throw it over the wall. Like, it's early enough in the process that if we discover ergonomic issues or preference changes, we can make those changes without it being a big issue. But yeah.
I mean, Jay, you just really I wish you controlled like whatever you did at Netflix and engineering controlled like things like the Love is Blind cast, He does.
He actually does.
So my girlfriend and I just finished The Ultimatum, and we're watching the
the Ultimatum is so good.
It's so bad, it's so good. Like and the Perfect Match is not as crazy, but it's good. It's still good. Is
Perfect Match the one where they're on the island?
No.
Or they're like on a beach or something? Like somehow?
Yeah, they do have a beach. But really it's taking, I know we're talking about unrelated things, but honestly, I was not a reality TV person until The Ultimatum. Like, it's so bad that it's good. Like, you're like just drama.
You gotta watch like Love is Blind. I didn't like Perfect Match. I watched it to watch it, yeah. But Love is Blind is.
My wife and my oldest daughter watched Love is Blind. I caught bits and pieces of it. The nicest thing about having a teenage daughter in your house is like you don't have to watch like reality shows with your wife very much anymore.
Oh, that's really nice.
Because she's into it. So then they've got company and they can discuss it amongst themselves, and I can just come out and be like, like, why would anyone subject themselves to being on this show? And then I
would subject myself. I would.
Yeah.
I've been trying to convince Jay to get on Love is Blind forever.
Yeah, I can't as an employee. Again, the friends of employees can't either. So.
Oh, it means I could never get on Love is Blind? Mm-mm. Well, they don't have to know we're friends. How are they going to know?
Well,
Tracy's like, you're not my friend anymore.
I know. That's how you do it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm married, so that's annoying too. But yeah, I would go on there.
So you were talking about
Jay's like,
just looping the specs. I know some people are like, what is going on?
Yeah.
You were talking about like, what is a spec and all this stuff. Like, I mean, it's going to vary, obviously, but it could be as simple as a document that just describes what you're doing, like in paragraphs. And, but often, you're going to have code examples. You're going to have API, like types, like a lot of stuff I'm doing right now is GraphQL related stuff. So there's a lot of schema spelunking and designing. And then, usage examples and what have you.
Like so helpful.
The big thing is like going back to, if it's really, really critically important that you make things really clear, then you do want to use those sort of standardized language, like you may do something, you must do something, or should. But
then even better is just building it into your CI pipeline, right? Like, can't you just force people to?
Yeah. It's the hard thing is just, it's really hard to enforce things cross-platform. Like, there's no real tooling that exists that I'm aware of that works well, at least. That is where you're able to like write a enforcement like spec in code. Like you say, when this happens, this should happen. That works across different platforms. Like, in the sense of, it works for web, it works for TV, iOS, Android. They all just kind of work differently, and how they interact is different.
Okay, so how much money would we make if we started a startup that did that? Like, is that valuable?
It might be an impossible. I mean, I wouldn't say possible, but insurmountable problem.
You love a good challenge.
Sure, yeah.
Wait, could a person do it though? Like, maybe all you really need to do for this startup is just like have a person in the middle that like is like, hey, you screwed up.
Yeah.
That's what the architect's usually there for.
Yeah.
It's like the little
architecture. It's the architecture enforcement
developer.
division. That's what I'm talking about. Like, this is the architecture enforcement division. If you deviate from the architecture, then this group of people shows up and beats the crap out of you.
Dude, I should use that as like one of the services that this dot's provided. Architectural Enforcement Department. Talk about why everyone needs it.
Yep. If you mess up, they parachute in and.
Yeah. Well, I was Googling, Jay. Okay, I see high level design document, but I was Googling like architectural design spec doc, front end development. I guess this one isn't so bad. Why design documents matter? Because you're basically just talking about a design document.
Yeah.
And
it's hard. So the word design can get overloaded, but in this case, we're talking about behaviors and APIs, how something should work and function. And when you're dealing with lots of different platforms, it's really important, like different platforms as in like different, like iOS, Android, TV.
Yeah.
It's important to be very clear about, you're going to share. Sweet.
What do you think?
What time is
Joel
it?
Sposki's. 2000. Geez. Well.
Nice.
Here we go.
Yeah, but this is an example. This is a great, like like a lot of the spec docs will have like a summary, and then it'll have a motivate. Like here at Netflix, at least, it'll have a summary, a motivation, a proposal, and then like risks. I think personally, not a lot of docs have this, but I really like having a risks section.
Yeah.
Basically, it acknowledges like the risks and is frank and obvious about them, because people are going to continue to bring them up. And so it's best to just acknowledge them in the document and say why you believe that this risk can be mitigated, or that you don't believe that we know this is a risk. We know it might happen. There's really no mitigation. We're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Like not engineering things for certain scenarios, right? Like example would be like, I've made an architectural decision on this one particular case not to worry about cancellation or something weird, because no one's going to click the button fast enough for it to be a problem. Like, I don't know. There's like
but
having
it
the
might happen, Ben. It might
decisions
happen,
around
so
it.
it
Well,
needs to be there.
The architect, like, so the building architect would be like, all right, so it's possible literally anywhere you build a building that an earthquake could happen, right? And but the risk is so low in some cases that it's like, okay, I don't need to spend an extra $100,000 on steel beams for this, because
it is really sad when I see like over-architected projects, because sometimes we walk into projects at this side and I'm like, I'm so sorry. You're having to, like, literally, it's like we've worked on projects where it's like, well, this person is spending an extra 30% because somebody over-architected the hell out of something. And here we go.
Here's a question for Jay. Jay, what do you think's better? Something that's over-architected or something that's under-architected?
Ooh,
that's a really good question. I mean, it depends. As most software,
it depends.
But I mean,
spoken like a true architect,
right? Exactly. Generally, as long as if I'm the person who over-architected it, I'd rather it be over-architected. If I'm not the person, like in the sense of like, I'm trying to think of like maintainability is what I mean. Like in the sense of like, if you make a mistake in your over-architecture, you're the person who understands it and has to maintain it. I actually kind of prefer that. Like, but 99% of the time, that's not going to be the case. And it's also really cruel to do that, because what if you're fired? What if you quit? What if you die? Someone is going, what if you change roles, or like you work on different projects? Someone else is going to have to pick up your mess, which happens 99% of the time. So I would say that generally it's better to under architect than it is to over, but it's such a hard statement to make because it really does depend.
Yeah.
And another thing, another thing that I wanted to acknowledge is that these, if for folks that are watching this, is if you work at a company who has some sort of promotion process, or even just has, normal employee reviews for compensation, these sort of spec documents also can serve as evidence of the sort of effort that went into making this new system, because it can be really easy for management to not realize and acknowledge the thought that went into and the deliberate actions that went into these sorts of things.
It's like showing your work.
Yeah, honestly, even things that don't end up being successful at companies that are reasonable, that's still evidence of as long as the document was thorough and like sometimes you don't know what you don't know. Like you can, for example, Netflix does so many A/B tests and they'll make a like basically a spec for that test where they're going to test some new feature, some new change, and most of them aren't good, like end up being thrown away. Like we test them, they don't perform well, and we throw them away. And that's still evident. You have that evidence of the hypothesis, the motivation and the proposal and the risks. And so it can be good for your career to do these sorts of things. I mean, you can take it to the extreme. Like Google has a reputation. I don't know whether it's true or not. Ben can probably tell us more, but Google has a reputation for people taking that to the extreme and making spec docs for things that don't need spec docs.
That was Ben's favorite job at Google.
Portfolio,
that was his entire job.
Promo-driven development, I think, is what people call it. Like
promo-driven development, absolutely.
Yeah. So you have to be careful.
Yeah, Jay has a hard stop. So it was good chatting with you, Jay. Thanks all for listening. You can follow Jay on Twitter. He's very nice.
Hi. JP helps.
Yeah. JP Ben not so much, but
I'm awful. I'm the meanest. I'm basically the Grinch on Twitter.
Yeah. So come hang out with us on Twitter. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.